Hey guys, my name is Trevor Sullivan and welcome back to my video channel. Thanks so much for joining me on another video, and what we're going to be talking about in this video is the Windmill low-code platform. Hopefully you've already seen my playlist that talks about a variety of different topics around Windmill, and we're just going to keep learning about additional integrations with the Windmill platform. In my last video, I actually did a demonstration on how you can integrate a Windmill application with another low-code platform known as Baserow, which allows you to store data inside a tabular format, very similar to how Airtable works, where you have a graphical interface and a REST API that you can integrate your application with in order to store, manipulate, and retrieve data from that back end. But what we're going to be doing in this video is something a little bit different, which is sending emails from a Windmill application. So let's say, for example, that you need to send some kind of transactional email. For example, things like password resets, right? If a user forgets their password and they click on a link that says forgot password, and you take them through a series of prompts to help them remember their password or send them an email to automatically reset their password, then that would be considered something like a transactional email versus promotional or marketing emails that are generally used to generate new business, awareness, and that kind of thing. So we're going to kind of come up with a contrived example here where we send transactional emails through an email provider, but we're not going to be using SMTP protocol to send email. We're actually just going to be integrating with a provider using the REST API that they expose, as many different providers these days for SMTP actually expose a REST API that's easier to use than whatever programming language you're using's native SMTP libraries, which is generally pretty antiquated. So what we're going to be doing is building up a kind of mock example here where we have a password reset application, and we can add an array of email addresses that we want to send a transactional email to. So I could add in something like arith86@proton.me, click on add target here. You can see that that email address is added to a list. I could plug in some other email address like, bill@example.com, say add target. And so I'm just building out an array of email addresses here. And when I click on send email, my application in Windmill here is going to iterate across this list of email addresses and send a password reset to each of those users. So what we're going to do for starters here is to just create a new workspace. So I'm going to go ahead and just do a new workspace down here. And then we're going to give this a name like send email, and we'll just hit create workspace here. So we have kind of a fresh environment to work inside of in Windmill. And the first thing that we're going to need to do is to develop our back-end automation script that's going to be used to interact with the REST API for our email provider. So for this particular example, I'm going to be using the Python runtime here. So we'll just choose Python, and you can see it generates a bunch of example code here. But of course, we can get rid of most of this right here because we're going to be customizing everything from the input parameters all the way to the actual code that gets executed here. So we're just going to start with a basic main function here with an empty return statement. And then inside the body of this function, we're going to plug in the code to call the REST API for the email provider that we choose in order to call their REST API. So at this point, we need to find a email provider that we want to use. And there are tons of them out there. If you just do a quick web search for SMTP providers, there's a lot of ones that have a free tier there. There's SendGrid, which I believe is a Twilio-based company. There's Mailgun. There's another one I'm aware of called MailJet as well. There's Elastic Email. I've never used that one. There's one here called MooSend. And so there's just a bunch of different SMTP providers that oftentimes expose their SMTP capabilities by using a REST API instead. So I'm going to go ahead and use this one here called Send in Blue. They've actually been rebranded as Brevo, and you can actually sign up for free with them. So if we go over to the Brevo website right here, you can see I've already got an account with them, and they actually provide up to 300 emails daily. So if I just click on usage up here, you can see I've only sent 5 emails today so far, and you do get 300 every single day. So if you're building like self-hosted applications that are kind of light usage, then Brevo is an excellent email provider that also exposes a REST API that's pretty easy to use from any programming language that you want to. And since they provide 300 emails every single day rather than a monthly quota, it's a really nice platform for, again, small instances of an application. So I'm going to go ahead and be using this platform here. And if we go down to transactional down here, you can see I've already sent a few emails right here. But what we're going to be doing is actually setting up a API key with our email provider here so that we can send out transactional emails from this service here. So we need to go find their API documentation. We're also going to be setting up our API key as well. So let's head over to SMTP and API under our user settings right here. Of course, once you've registered an account, we can go over to API keys right here, and we can simply generate a new API key. I'll just call this windmill2 for now. We'll click on generate, and we'll just copy this to our clipboard so that we can import that as a secret into our windmill instance. All right, so now we need to look at the API documentation. So we'll just hit this button right down here to read the Brevo documentation. I'm not sure if it's Brevo or Brevo. I would say Brevo, but I've never actually heard it pronounced before. And then down here under the use cases, we want to use the email API to create and send transactional emails. So let's hit that documentation. And if we scroll down just a little bit here, they actually provide this curl example right here that shows us the data structure that we need to send to the service in order to interact with it to send an email. So right here, we've got the endpoint URL that we need to connect to. We also have several different headers that we need to specify here. We can accept JSON responses. We are sending a JSON payload. And right here in the middle, we also have an API key that we're going to use to authenticate to the Brevo REST API as our user account. That's the API key that we just generated. And then down here under the data parameter in curl, that's basically the JSON payload that we want to send to the service. And if you take a look at the JSON data structure here, we have this outer object here that has a sender, to, subject, and HTML content properties. And then in particular, we have under sender here a child object with name and email. So that's the person who's sending the email. And then you have a to field right down here. And to is actually an array because a single sender can actually send an email to multiple recipients, right? So that's why the to field here is an array instead of a single value. So this is basically the JSON data structure that we need to come up with in our Python application in order to construct a payload that we can send off to the Brevo API and send off emails successfully. So what we're going to do is in our application here, we're going to be using a library for Python. This is the same library that we actually used in my base row video that I just recently published. And we're going to be using HTTPX library for Python in order to send a post request to the Brevo REST API. All we need to do is provide the endpoint. And we also need to provide the JSON data that we want to send to the API, which we're going to dynamically generate inside of our Python script. So let's go ahead and import the HTTPX library here so that we can send HTTP requests. And then we are going to do HTTPX.post, and then we'll specify the URL parameter as a variable right here. And so we need to define a variable that contains the endpoint. So we'll do URL equals, and then let's go ahead and just copy that value from the Brevo API right over here. Let's go to the documentation and copy this endpoint, and we'll just come back and paste in that URL. Now, if you take a look at this URL, you'll notice that that is just a static URL. There's no input parameters that we have to append to the URL because all of the parameters are either determined by the headers that we pass in to the HTTP request or in the JSON payload that we're sending. So nothing has to change with respect to that URL. We also need to specify a Python dict containing headers. So we'll just create a headers dict right here. We'll do API key, and we'll just set that to an empty value for now. We'll do the accept header as application JSON, put a comma after that, put a comma after API key, and then we'll also do content dash type is application JSON as well, because we are sending a JSON payload to the remote service, right? Now let's go back to the API key here. So I need to go ahead and insert a variable right here. So what I'm going to do is say add a new variable here, and we'll just call this Brevo API key, and we'll paste in our value right down here. All right, so let's save that, and then we'll just click right here to insert that, and we'll remove those double quotes right there. And now you can see that we've got a reference to the Windmill API, the library for Python, and it's calling get variable in order to dynamically retrieve that API key. So if we ever have to revoke and regenerate a new API key, we can just update that variable, and we don't have to change any code inside of our script here. So now that we've declared the headers here, we'll go ahead and just add that to another input argument here. So we'll say headers equals the headers variable. And now we also need to specify our JSON data as a payload, right? So we need to go ahead and construct a Python object that represents the same data structure that we saw over in the documentation right here for sending a transactional email. So we need to create a top-level object that has all of these top-level properties and all of the child properties as well. So what we're going to do is say data equals, and then we'll use curly braces for an object, and we'll just say we'll actually start with sender here, and we'll set that to an object. We'll do a name as Trevor Sullivan's service. I'll leave out the single quote there just for simplicity so we don't have to escape it. And then my email will plug in as trevor@trevorsullivan.net. So that's our sender. Now we also need to specify who we're sending to, the recipients of the email. So that's going to be under the to field right here. So under to, we'll set that to a Python list, and we'll create a singular entry here, and we're going to plug in a name and an email, but this is going to be parameterized because every time that we run this function, we're going to be sending to a different address. So for name right here, I'll go ahead and just specify an empty string for now, and email, I'll just specify an empty string as well, and then we'll declare those as input parameters up here. So let's go ahead and do that really quick. We'll say to name as a string, and then we'll say to adder as a string as well. And so down here for name, we'll say to name, and for email, we'll say to adder. All right, so now that we've got that to set up, let's go ahead and specify our subject line here. So we'll say subject is equal to reset your password now. And then for our HTML content, make sure that C is capital there. We're going to specify a value of, HTML/HTML. And then inside here, we'll just say body/body. And then we'll just do an H1/H1 that says reset your password. And then underneath of that, we'll just do some paragraph text with a p tag. And we'll say click, and then do an href equals example.com. We'll do reset.example.com. And then we'll close off the a tag and say here to reset your password. All right, so I think that should be pretty good. Now we need to pass in this payload into our post call here. So we're just going to do JSON equals, and then the data variable that we just declared from lines 14 through 27. All right, so now we just need to capture the result here. We'll capture the result and then just say print the result. And I'm also going to print result.message as well. Actually, I think it's under .content here. So we're going to grab the resulting payload just to make sure that we don't get an error message or get some kind of success message or something like that. So that'll be good logging information to have anytime that we run our function here. So this is looking pretty good at this point, and all we need to do is pass in a couple of parameters here. I'm actually just going to pass in a single parameter. Let's do to_address, and I'm just going to use that same parameter for both the name and the address, just to keep things as simple as possible here. But you could set things up so that you could pass in two different arguments if you wanted to. So let's go ahead and test this function out. So we'll do a save right here. And let me just rename this really quick as well. So I'll just do a edit right here. I think we can rename from somewhere in here. Anyways, I can't find that. Actually, let's do customize. Do I have a rename here? All right, I'm not seeing a rename option right here. Oh, I can edit the path here. So let's call this Brevo send password reset. And then for the summary, we'll say sends password reset via Brevo REST API. And that should be good. All right, so let's do save draft once again, and we'll go ahead and deploy. And now I've got a test email here, so arith86@proton.me. So what we're going to do is just plug that in, say arith86@proton.me, and we'll run our script. And as you can see, we have a null result because our return statement doesn't actually return anything. However, under the response right here, you can see we got an HTTP 201 from the Brevo API, and it also gave us a message ID, which means that it successfully sent that message. So let's check over in the Brevo console right here and see if it actually sent one out. We can actually take a look at our transaction history to make sure that the Brevo API actually sent an email. And as you can see right here, it sent one email at 2:08 p.m. local time, and it delivered one as well. Actually, that's not local time. That's 3 hours earlier than local time for me. So I'll have to see if maybe there's a time zone setting or something like that. But at least the minute is correct. So I know that it corresponds to the time that we just sent this. And in the logs here, you can actually see the subject line of the email that was sent and who it was sent to. So as you can see, we have reset your password now is the subject line that we entered. All right, so now that we have tested out our function, we can go ahead and build a simple API around it, or actually a user interface around it, I meant. So let's come back to our workspace here, and we're going to create an application, and we're going to add a text field so that we can add in a new email address to a list. So we'll add in a text. We actually need a text input here. So let's do text and then text input. And then one of the things we can do here is just to change the default text right there. It's called the placeholder text. So we'll just say email address ... and that'll just kind of indicate what belongs there. Then we need to add a button to append the email address to our list that we want to send to. We'll say add email address. And then we also need to, well, let's make this a little bit wider here so that we can fit that all inside there. And then we also need to have a list to actually display the emails that we've currently added. So I'm going to go ahead and just add in a list item right here. And the default layout for the list is to have this card-based approach where each item in a list is represented by a card. But I'm going to change that to a full row instead so that they are vertically stacked instead of horizontally on a grid. Also, the default height of these list elements is 280 pixels, which is way too much for my use case. So I'm going to change the default height to 60 pixels here. So now you can see that these dashed rows are much shorter than the default. Now we also need to give these elements some names. So let's go ahead and add one more button to actually submit the email. Let's add a button here and say send email. And then for our text input here, let's rename that to txt new email. For our button B right here, let's rename that to txt add email address. And then for C here, this is our list addresses of currently added items. And then for D down here, we'll do txt send email. All right, so now we have good names for each of our elements here, but we actually need to add in some kind of element to display the email addresses that we add to our array down here in our list. So we'll go ahead and just add a new text display component into our list here so that for each item in our list, we can display the value of that email address. All right, so now what we want to do is to actually change the input data source right here. So we're going to eliminate these default items. And then what we're going to do is in our application state right up here, we're going to create a new property under the state, the global state variable, so that we can actually store a list of email addresses in our application that we want to send to. And then once we've queued all of those up, we can just click on send email, and that will invoke the action to send through the API. All right, so what we need to do is take the text from this txt new email when we click on add email address and append it to a new state property. So for the button add email address, I'm just going to go ahead and say create a new inline script here. We're going to create a new front end script. And what we're going to do is say if the state.email list, and that property email list doesn't exist yet, we're going to go ahead and create it. So if that does not exist, or if it's set to null, then we want to go ahead and set it to a default value of an empty array. So we'll just say if state.emaillist is equal to something, then we want to return state.emaillist. And we also want to assign it on the left-hand side here. So we'll say state.emaillist equals the result of this expression here. So if it's not nothing, then it should initialize it to an empty array. Otherwise, it'll just return the current array value. So let's go ahead and save this and click on this button right here. And hopefully it'll initialize to an empty array. And I just realized that I had this reversed, so we actually need to remove the exclamation point there, because if it does have a value, then we want to return the current value. Otherwise, we want an empty array. So let's click on the button again, and now you can see that email list has turned into an empty array. So now what we can do is actually add new items from txt new email into this email list array in memory, and then we can send our messages. So back here in our button code, we're going to say that we want to push a new item onto that array. So we'll do state.emaillist.push, and then we'll take txt new email.result. And this result property contains the text that's actually been typed by the user into this txt new email box. And we want to just push that onto state.emaillist. And then based on the way that Windmill's kind of magic happens behind the scenes, we actually have to assign state.emaillist equal to state.emaillist. Otherwise, this email list state will not be updated. So now let's go ahead and test this out really quick. So we'll call this send reset email and say save initial draft. And so now what we want to do is just type in an address here like aerith86@proton.me, click on add email address. And now if we take a look at our state.emaillist property, you can see that we've appended a single array element to this array. So now that we've got this array populated, let's try adding a second address, maybe aerith87@proton.me. I don't even know if that's a valid address, but now you can see that we have a second array element in that list. So now what we want to do is to actually display those elements inside of list addresses here. So we need to set the data source of list addresses to the state.email list. So what we'll do is just go ahead and specify that we want to wire it up to state.email list. And then for each item in that list, we just want to display the value from each of those items. So now what we'll do is go into the A object here, which is that text display element inside of each list item. And what we want to do is set the template right here to the current item dot value. So if we do a iter dot value right here, you can see that each item in the list is going to be displayed in this list right here. Also, we could use a string template here in JavaScript so that we can actually inject a little emoji, like a little mail icon right here. And that'll just make things look a little bit nicer here. Actually, it looks like it doesn't like those backticks there, but we can just prefix it with that little mail icon. Now that's just for display purposes. That little mail icon is not going to get injected into the actual email list right here. So that just gives us a little bit of visual styling here. So now that we've got the list of email addresses being displayed that we've currently queued up in our application, we can go ahead and implement the code to actually send an email. So what we need to do is say that we want to trigger our backend script that we've already written for each item inside of our array. So normally you might think that we would just go to the button called txt send email, and then we'd say, all right, I want to select a script or flow, go over to my workspace scripts, and then say, I'm going to choose this script right here. Now, the challenge with doing this is that in Windmill, we can't pass an array element into this input into this function individually. We could pass the entire array into the function and have the function handle the processing of each array element. But if you want to trigger this function once per array element from the user interface, then we have to take a slightly different approach. So rather than simply wiring the button here, send email up directly to the script, I'm just going to hit the little X here to eliminate that connection. And now what we're going to do is create a new background runnable. And the background runnable here is actually going to reference our script that we've already created. So I'm just going to choose to select a already pre-existing script. I'll go to my workspace scripts, and we're going to call this script here. Now, remember that we have to specify the to address every single time that we run this script. And what we're going to do is we're going to uncheck this little box here that says run on start and app refresh, because we only want this background script to run when we specifically want it to. However, I'm going to leave recompute on any input changes. And then what we're going to do is wire up the input here to a new state variable that's only going to contain a single email address for each element of this email list array. So what we're going to do is go over to eval right here, and we're going to say that we want to grab state.current email. Now you might say, well, state.current email doesn't currently exist, right? It's not defined anywhere under the state global variable. And if you said that, you would of course be correct. However, what we're going to do is wire up our txt send email button here to actually iterate over our list of emails here and set that variable so that we can trigger our background script. So all we have to do in order to trigger the background script is set the current email property, and because recompute on any input changes is already set, Windmill is automatically going to trigger this every time that we change the value of that variable. So let's go back to the send email button right here. It's usually a good idea to select it in the left-hand navigation right here instead of clicking on it, since that will actually invoke it if there is something wired up to it. And then what we're going to do is say create a new front-end JavaScript here. And so now what we want to do is actually iterate over each element of this array email list and then assign state.currentEmail to each of those values, and that will automatically trigger the background script. So what we'll do is say state.emailList dot for each, and then we'll take that element and pass it into an anonymous function here, and we'll just say state.currentEmail equals element. So that'll take each element value from this array here and set it to the current email. So I'm going to go ahead and actually remove this Arith87 from here just so that we don't accidentally send an email to somebody that we don't actually know. So let's go ahead and just refresh our application here so it's empty. And then we'll go ahead and add Arith86 at proton.me, and we'll just use a single address for now. All right, so now when we click on send email, it should go ahead and define state.currentEmail. And as you can see, it iterated across that array with one element inside of it. It set current email, and by setting current email, that should have automatically triggered this background script to run. So now if we take a look at our debug runs up here, you can see that sure enough, BG0, the background script, has executed, and we successfully communicated with the Brevo API to send an email. So now let's go over to our email interface here. And as you can see, we do have an email from our service right here. So that's how we can kind of wire things up and have that background script automatically execute once for each array element. Now, just to make sure that it does actually work with more than one element, I'm actually going to add arith at proton.me at 2 separate times right here and make sure that it actually sends 2 emails instead of just one. So if we check out our Brevo interface right here, we should in just a few moments see that we get 2 emails sent out at the current minute, which is 23 instead of 22. So let's go ahead and make sure that 2 get sent instead of 1. So we'll go ahead and just say send email here once again. And let's check our run history right here and make sure that it sends. And so as you can see right here, it looks like we are going to need to refresh this view really quick. And it looks like it's actually not triggering here. And that's probably happening because we're not actually changing the value of state.currentEmail because it's already been set to a particular value and we're just setting it to the exact same value once again. So what I'm going to do instead actually is to add arith86 at proton.me and we'll say add, and then I'll also add my own address, Trevor at trevorsullivan.net, say add. And now that we've refreshed our application state once again, current email isn't set. So we'll do send email. And now the last email that was used is Trevor at trevorsullivan.net right there. So let's go back to the Brevo interface right here. And as you can see, it looks like at 2:25 right here, we had at least one email sent. So we've got the one to myself, but it doesn't look like it sent the other one to arith86. So that's probably happening because I'm simply iterating over those elements too quickly. So we'd probably have to put some kind of delay in there to make sure that each element is actually getting set properly. So if we come back to our run history here in Windmill, and open up our script execution history, you can see that it actually seems to have skipped over the first email and only executed the second one. So something we'd probably want to do is to put in a little bit of a delay so that we can ensure that the application has time to process each of the email addresses in our array. So inside of my front-end script here, I'll just set a timeout and set it to maybe 1,000 milliseconds here. And then for each element here, we're going to call the set timeout function. And so what we'll do is set the current email to element here. And we want to make sure that we wait the timeout period. And then we also want to say timeout plus equals 1,000 so that we wait another second for each of these emails to process. So let's go ahead and save that, and we'll try this out again right here. Plug in a couple of different email addresses. I'll actually use another one on proton.me, open source dev at proton.me. Let's add that as well, and let's do send email. And of course, I forgot to use the let keyword right here, so it's complaining that we don't have a declared variable. Let's do send email this time. And now that should have introduced a little bit of a delay there. So let's go back to our run history right there. And now you can see we've actually executed our script twice here. However, it looks like the job process was killed because it was canceled. So we're probably not giving it enough time to execute because it is taking more than a second to execute. So back in our application here, what we'll do is just specify a larger timeout period. Let's say maybe 2 seconds per email instead. We'll actually add 2,000 right there. And I'll go ahead and just specify the first iteration at 1,000. So let's go ahead and see if that's enough time. We'll do arith86 at proton.me and say add. And then we'll do open source dev at proton.me and add that as well. And let's try this one last time. All right, so let's go back to our run history right here. And as you can see this time, just a few seconds ago, we sent our first one to Aerith86 at proton.me, and our second one to opensourcedev at proton.me worked just fine as well, because it did take a little bit over a second to run, and we can't run these in parallel. So as you can see, this is a pretty simple application that we were able to build where we can use a list component to display the array of email addresses that we wanted to send a message to. You could make this a lot more dynamic where you could actually inject the subject line and the HTML body content of the message using something like Jinja templating engines or other templating engines that are available out there for Python. But I just wanted to keep things really simple and just specify a hard-coded subject line, a hard-coded HTML body, and show you how you can send out a bulk email to multiple addresses by simply entering them into a user interface with Windmill and then using some basic front-end and back-end code to actually send an email through the SMTP API, through the Brevo provider, or any SMTP provider that you select. So I hope you learned something new from this video about interacting with REST APIs or sending emails or building out Windmill user interfaces with JavaScript. Feel free to subscribe to my channel down here and leave a like on this video if you did learn something new. Also, don't forget to join the Discord channel, or the Discord server, I should say, for Windmill. It's accessible right here from the interface in Windmill. Somewhere right down here it says feedbacks, and you can just click on that. It'll take you to an invitation for their Discord server where the founder of the company and his engineers are very easily accessible and very open to feedback, rapidly iterating and always improving the Windmill tool. Also, leave a comment below and let me know what you thought of this video and what other types of videos you'd like to see on my video channel. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Take care.